Hello, Steve White, Checkboy 89 for Steve Arts 89. Well, it's already September 8th in Australia. September 8th, 2022, the 56th anniversary of the original Star Trek, which premiered on September 8th back in 1966. I think on NBC at 8:30 prime time. And I just wanted to do a video on it, mostly because the anniversary of the original Star Trek is kind of being buried by the new Star Trek Day, which they have on the same day as the anniversary of the original Star Trek, and it's all about the new Star Trek shows, and it doesn't really pay any attention to or do anything to promote the original Star Trek or Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, the animated series. They're sort of acknowledging Next Generation because of Picard, but I just really didn't want it to get lost. I wanted to do at least one video about the anniversary of the original Star Trek. I love the original Star Trek. I'm a bit of a purist. I was introduced to it on syndication, where it was just on TV when I was a kid. I think on the weekends, I think on Sunday. I just saw a few episodes. The first episode I ever saw was the Galileo 7. I remember The Devil in the Dark and a few episodes, and I had one of the annuals with reprints of the Gold Key issues and a couple of Gold Key comics, and that was my introduction to Star Trek as a kid, and I fell in love with it. Later, as I was a teenager, we had Next Generation on video. I rented it out, and then it was on TV, but it wasn't on TV in Tasmania until way after it was out on video. And then we had the Selfie videos, and then Deep Space Nine, Next Generation. I keep saying that in the wrong order. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise. I followed them all. I watched them all. Enterprise was the only one I watched week to week because they stopped releasing the videos, because most fans would watch the videos. They'd wait for the videos to come out, rent them, and so forth in Australia, because we didn't get them as quickly as America. And also we had the network that would air them at random times between anywhere between 10 and midnight. So that was my introduction to Star Trek. And for me, I love the original Star Trek. Like I said, I'm a purist, and a lot of people baffle me when they say they're a Star Trek fan, and then you ask them about the original series, and they say, I don't watch the original series, I've never watched the original series. I hate the original series. People like Jesse Gender, who hates the original Star Trek and hate Gene Roddenberry, yet they call themselves Star Trek fans. I'm like, no, you're a Next Generation fan or a Discovery fan or a Deep Space Nine fan. You're not a Star Trek fan. You can't be a Star Trek fan if you don't like Star Trek, if you don't watch Star Trek, because it's Star Trek. You have to be a fan of Star Trek to be a Star Trek fan. It baffles me the way Star Trek is sort of treated today. Now, how Star Trek originally started off was also kind of complicated, and there are a few little stories that kind of get ignored when people talk about it. Like, for example, when Gene pitched the show to Desilu, somebody bought it essentially, and when it was first sort of told to Lucille Ball, who ran the studio, she didn't understand what it was. I don't know how much detail she was given, but she thought it was a show on the USO performers performing for the troops. She thought it was Star Trek. Now, she was eventually given a more proper sort of pitch or whatever, and apparently she basically just went along with it to save face, because she was asking, where's that show about the USO performers? And they're like, what, Star Trek? And they're like, and they gave her the pitch for the Star Trek show they were developing, and she did sign off on it. Ultimately, she greenlit it and produced it and everything, but the first initial introduction, she had no idea what it was. So I do wonder what would have happened if she'd been given a proper explanation for what the show was. Would she maybe have not had it go forward because of the potential expenses of a science fiction show, or would she have been just as interested in that information as she was in the information she was given later? I don't know. But either way, she still is the mother of Star Trek, despite that story. Now, the original pilot, people call it the original pilot. It's the first episode of Star Trek. It is the most important episode of Star Trek. A lot of people try and dismiss it as not mattering and say it isn't even canon, which baffles me. Basically, they filmed it. The studio loved the idea, but they had some issues. They wanted them changed, and it sold the series. So it was essentially a pilot, but it sold the series, so it was the first series. But two things happened. One that doesn't get discussed, one that does. One was that they wanted changes. They weren't happy with number one. A lot of women apparently didn't like her when they did test screenings and so forth. Some of the producers didn't because they're misogynist and they didn't want a strong woman. So for both of those reasons, and Spock had to be changed. All these things were happening. And then in the midst of all that, apparently Jeffrey Hunter, the star of Star Trek, his wife came in and said, "My husband is a movie star. He is not doing this little science fiction series." He didn't know apparently that she did this, but he was out of the series then. So they had all these changes, they lost the star, and they basically, the series went from sort of going forward into, let's do another pilot. So the first sort of, the plans for the first episode really turned into another pilot. And that's where No Man Has Gone Before, which unfortunately wasn't the first episode aired. It was great, and I always thought this was because The Man Trap was the only episode that was finished at the time, but that wasn't true. They had several episodes to pick from, but for some reason they thought the general audience would be more embracing of or understanding of the more generic science fiction elements of The Man Trap, which is basically a monster on the ship. So unfortunately, really the first episode that should have been aired should have been The Cage, but they couldn't really do that. So then When No Man's Gone Before wasn't the first either. The Cormorant Maneuver wasn't the first either. So it's very frustrating. If you grew up... I was introduced to Star Trek really on video. I saw The Cage first, then When No Man's Gone Before. I saw them in the production order, which is how they should be seen. But unfortunately, the DVD and Blu-ray, they show them in the airing order because they're trying to recreate the experience of watching it on TV. That includes, unfortunately, shows in the wrong episode order. So I hate that. But the show went on. It was an amazing hit. It went into syndication. There were a lot of issues why it was cancelled. It did do better in the ratings than is really sort of believed in popular culture. It wasn't... The real issue was that Paramount bought Desilu and they just didn't want to produce this show. They didn't create it, they didn't initiate it, and a lot of the times when studios take over, or people buy a studio, or one studio takes over from another studio or buys the content or whatever, they don't want to continue someone else's work, someone else's baby. And that's what happened with Star Trek. It was a very expensive show, it didn't have huge ratings, and they used that to justify getting rid of it. And they managed to get an extra season out of the show because it was supposed to end in the second season, but the fans protested so much they thought, I don't know, they just ended up keeping it for an extra year. So we got an extra year of it, but unfortunately Gene left because they moved it to a time that they basically burned him on a bunch of things they agreed to that they burnt him on. So he left. It did affect the show a bit. Some questionable things were done, but ultimately the series went on, and the season went on in the series. It's all pretty great. Then went into syndication. It was put in a decent time slot, and it got a lot of attention, a lot of views, and people realised how great the show was. Then they wanted to produce a new show. Gene didn't want to come back and deal with them because they had burned him so bad, so they did an animated series, which he did with Filmation, because that was different people, and apparently he was open to that. Then they were going to do phase 2, but there were issues with that. They were going to exploit Star Trek and use that to launch another network for Paramount, but that didn't work. So when they cancelled that, they cancelled the show, and they went on with Star Trek the Motion Picture, because it had originally begun as a TV movie and it had gone back to a TV movie I think a couple of times. So they did Star Trek the Motion Picture, and Gene was in charge of that, and it was brilliant. It was a great science fiction movie. It gets a lot of negative attention, like The Cage, because a lot of people see Star Trek as this very conventional sort of goodies and baddies sort of science fiction adventure show, when it was a lot more than that when you actually watch it. A lot of people who don't know the show, who just sort of know it from clips and just from its iconic status, think it's something other than it's not. So Gene did a great movie, but unfortunately, because of all the politics involved in the show and it not being as critically received as well as it could have been, because it wasn't just a retread and a continuation of the series, but more of a science fiction movie done in the Star Trek universe. And it probably didn't make much money as it could have had it been more of a Star Wars, shoot 'em up sort of adventure, which is what Paramount wanted. Why they went to making it into a movie, and part of the reason why they went to making it into a movie and not continuing for series because they could have put it on another network or something. But so they pushed it into the background, and then we got Star Trek 2, which was a very reductive, militarized version of Star Trek, which was a really basic idea for the audience, where it's basically just a baddie and Kirk has to defeat the baddie, and that's basically as complicated as the movie was. And I do think it sort of hurt Star Trek, and it was a step backwards for Star Trek. Fortunately, even though he was cut out of the involvement in Star Trek 3 and 4, he had to be used for Star Trek Next Generation. They had to go to him, and they had to agree to a lot of his terms. And because they did it through syndication, direct syndication, they didn't have a network. He was able to have a lot of freedom. There were no notes. There was no questioning. There was no being told to do this, to do that. He just did it the way he wanted. And that's why the first 2 years of Next Generation, I think, are the best. Now, a lot of people would be shocked by that because everyone thinks the show got good after the 3rd season. That's because they turned it into a generic science fiction drama at that point. A drama in space, sorry, at that point. And it was more, people were able to understand it because it wasn't a science fiction, really strong science fiction show anymore, or not trying to be. It was very much just a conventional drama in space. And it had, all the lighting was standardized, the music was standardized. They got rid of the music from the first 2 seasons, which was much more dynamic like the original series. And they just made it really generic. And even though there's some amazing episodes at each of those seasons, I get a bit bored from the 3rd season of Next Generation on because so many episodes are just really generic drama filler set in space. A lot of it, and people are like, "How dare you say that?" But that's the truth. So for me, Star Trek really is the original series, or the Cage, the original series, the animated series, and the first 2 years of Next Generation. After that, it just starts to go backwards and backwards and backwards. Now, Rick Berman did his best to keep the original Star Trek, the original heart of it, true and everything. And he did manage to maintain that right through to the end of Enterprise. But then once that ended and they went into New Trek and the movies, just totally lost it, totally changed it, totally different. And now we have Star Trek Day instead of the anniversary of the original Star Trek. So I just want to do a little video expressing how I feel about Star Trek, a little bit of the history of how the show started, and how I feel about it, and the perception of it at the moment and everything. Star Trek Day is going to be a big event. I'm glad because in Australia it's already the anniversary. I can do this video now and put it up before all the Star Trek Day hoopla begins, and I have to cover that, which I'll do tomorrow technically in Australia. It's all about the new shows. It's all about the new universe. They wouldn't even pay any attention to the original Star Trek universe if Picard, wasn't, involved in that. So, it's kind of interesting now because it was all designed as, they wanted to basically steal CBS's income stream with the original Star Trek merchandise and everything. They thought, we're just going to make our own Star Trek and we will eventually replace the old Star Trek and we'll have that, that golden goose. That didn't quite work out. But now that Paramount and CBS have merged again, they do seem to be straightening Star Trek out. The last season of Discovery, the problem with Discovery was it destroyed Gene's universe, its utopian universe with the sort of perfect federation. They turned it into this sort of Trump Brexit sort of current day politics, whereas in Star Trek the issues were always outside. But they made it all inside and made it about us and made it very contemporary. Why? Because they thought that would appeal to audiences more. So they keep dumbing Star Trek down and trying to turn Star Trek into something less so that it appeals to more people. So that's a huge issue. But the last season of Discovery felt more like Star Trek. Even the last couple of episodes were very much motion picture level. I liked it. I was shocked. The next season of Picard, the first season of Picard, seems to be a throwback to Next Generation. They brought back the whole cast. It seems to be a shipboard adventure. It looks like now that they're working with CBS instead of trying to steal CBS's revenue stream and show and undermine it, Star Trek is looking a little better, but still they've lost what Star Trek really was. I don't know if they can get it back. And it's sad on the anniversary to be talking about Star Trek in the past tense because it's not being produced anymore. But it is still great. And I'm going to spend today watching a bunch of old documentaries, some going back as far as the 50th anniversary that I just haven't had the time to look at. And that's how I'm going to do with Star Trek Day, because I really love it so much that if I watch it, I have to really give it my attention and full time. And I don't sort of watch Star Trek sort of randomly. So I don't watch it very often because I have to actually sit down and make time for it and do it properly. So I don't have the time to watch any episodes. So I'm just going to watch a bunch of documentaries, just remind myself a bit about the show. I will cover Star Trek Day, but very much as something that's trying to replace and undermine Star Trek and the original Star Trek and the anniversary and all that, which is what it's doing. But I'm going to go. Feel free to share, like, comment, subscribe. Sorry I couldn't keep this to 10 minutes. I really tried, but there's just too much to talk about. And I'm just going to take my Enterprise and my Galileo and go watch some Star Trek documentaries.